Well, welcome everyone to week number 5 of our 19-week series, verse by verse, through the Gospel of John. And today we're picking it up in John chapter 2, and in a moment we're going to start reading from verse 12 of John chapter 2. Now let's do a really quick 3-minute summary of sort of where we've gotten so far in the first 4 weeks. We've learned that the word gospel is an ancient word for a literary genre. Essentially, it's a first-century Greco-Roman biography, but it's sort of a hybrid of a first-century Greco-Roman biography plus a first-century sermon about Jesus. The word gospel over the last 2,000 years has come to be known simply as a story about Jesus. That's not originally what the word meant. Evangelion was the Greek word. It was Roman emperors, when they gave news of the birth of one of their children, or when there was news of a great victory, it was called a gospel, evangelion, good news. And that was proclaimed. And it's sort of been taken over now over the last 2,000 years by the Christian community. It means basically now a story about Jesus. The author, we believe, it's a little bit disputed, but the author is, we're going with this John, who's the son of Zebedee, one of the original 12 disciples. Some think it might have been an elder named John, who is also a disciple of Jesus, but a well-respected elder from Jerusalem. But there's sort of discussion and debate about this. Certainly, it was from an eyewitness. There's no doubt about that. We then looked at the prologue, at the beginning, the first few verses of the Gospel of John. And the prologue in an ancient document is introducing the main character and the main theme of the document. And you're given insider information. So you as a reader know things that the people in the actual biography don't know, things that the crowd does not know. And you are told right from the beginning that in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Word became flesh and lived among us. So you're learning from the beginning that this Jesus is actually God in flesh who came and dwelt among us. And so you learn what and how and why right from the beginning. And then you realize, and this is that story. This is what happened when God took on flesh and lived among us. And then we moved and transitioned to the testimony of a man named John the Baptist, a prophet at that time who was paving the way for Jesus. And then we learned about the calling of Jesus' first disciples. He has still not called all 12 of them yet, but he called his first initial disciples. And the last time we were together, we read the description of Jesus' first miracle. It was at the turning of water into wine at a wedding. And we learned all about Jewish weddings and the role of wine in Jewish weddings in the first century. And we discussed Jesus' awkward interaction with his mother at that event and how there appeared to be an intentional distancing. He called her woman, why do you involve me in these things? There's sort of an intentional distancing between Jesus and his mother, not disrespectful, but intentional. And we also discussed the possible symbolism of that first miracle, which brings us now to John chapter 2, starting at verse 12. It says, "After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and there he stayed for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, 'Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market.' His disciples remembered that it is written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.'" All right. So what's going on here? First of all, let's talk about the chronology, meaning the order of events. What's the order of events? When did this actually take place? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what do you mean, when exactly did this take place? John says it took place early in Jesus' ministry. It's obvious. According to John's chronology of events, Jesus meets John the Baptist down in the southern part. Let's do a little quick map over here. So we have the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, the Mediterranean, and we said Nazareth was probably about here, Cana is about here, Jerusalem is about here, and Bethlehem is about here, we'll say, okay? And so we said what happened was, according to the chronology of the events, Jesus got baptized, Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, which is over here. So this is all the region of Judea. And So he's down in the southern part in Judea region. He gets baptized while he's down there. Then he calls some of his disciples, and he heads north. Probably went through here. Probably this was Samaria, and then this is the Galilee. So he probably, most likely, did what many of them did at that time, crossed over, and then he went up to Cana in the Galilee, where he attended a wedding there and performed his first miracle. And then it says he spent some time in Capernaum, which is right on the Sea of Galilee, right here, and sort of just north of Nazareth. And he spends some time over in Capernaum, and then he heads back down south to the Judean region and heads back into Jerusalem for the Passover festival. You say, so it's pretty straightforward, right? Well, it's not really that straightforward. Remember, we learned that there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we learned that most scholars believe that Mark was written first. There's some debate, but it was the first Gospel. And Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel as a reference point. And so these 3 are very similar, and those 3 are called the synoptic. That's where we get our word synonym, similar. So they're the synoptic Gospels. John is unique. John is different from these others. He did not use, though he'd be aware of these, I'm sure, because John was written last, most believe. So he would have been aware of them, but he did not follow the pattern that the 3 synoptics followed. And John, these 3 are more action-oriented, particularly Mark. John's many more discussions about what Jesus said, and he describes more of the back and forth and conversations. As opposed to these. So I say all that to say, according to the synoptic Gospels, the 3 synoptics, Jesus cleared the temple at the end of his ministry, not at the beginning of his ministry. In Matthew, it's in chapter 21, in Mark, it's in chapter 11, and Luke, it's in chapter 19. So is this a problem? Some would try to tell you it's a problem, but it's not really a problem. There are 2 possible explanations for this difference. One is Jesus could have done this twice, at the beginning, at the end of his ministry. That's a possibility, but that's highly unlikely. That's kind of a weak explanation. Second explanation is, I think, is much more likely. John's doing what every first century biographer was allowed to do. He arranged events according to his chosen theme, according to the emphasis he was seeking to make. John wasn't making up events. You weren't allowed to do that. But John was allowed to rearrange the order of events and change the chronology as a way of emphasizing different aspects of the character of the person's life that he was writing about. That was completely acceptable, as we talked in the very first week, for ancient Greco-Roman biographies. John was following the rules of a first-century Greco-Roman biographer. That's what John's doing here. For the synoptic writers, Jesus cleansing the temple is the culmination, the conclusion of a series of conflicts that raised the temperature between Jesus and the Jewish authorities. For the synoptic writers, this event is amongst the final notes of judgment against the darkness of those who claim to be God's representatives. But John, by mentioning his event here at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he's signaling that this judgment, this tension, was there from the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So, let's again reread verse 12. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. Well, you say, hold on. He went down. Well, he was in Cana, and he went down to Capernaum. Well, Capernaum's north. It's northeast. What's up with that? Well, this is the common phrase that you're going to see. We're going to see it in the next verse again as well. The direction is not talking, it's not talking direction, it's talking elevation. And so when you travel, when you come with me next time we go to Israel, which will probably be next year now, we're going to land in Tel Aviv down here. We're going to go up the coast. We're going to stop in Caesarea Philippi, maybe visit Armageddon, Megiddo here. We'll go to Nazareth. And then we'll drive this highway up and we'll come to Tiberias here, but then we'll visit the Sea of Galilee. And when you do this, you realize you're going to go down. When you get around to here in the Galilee, we start descending and descending, descending. And the Sea of Galilee is, I think it's below sea level, if I'm not mistaken. So it's very low. It's a sort of a deep valley almost, which is why storms come in. The winds blow in over there. So when you talk about going down, just like in a moment we're going to read, they went down to Jerusalem. Or went up to Jerusalem, I should say. They're heading south, but they're going up to Jerusalem. It's because the trip to Jerusalem, you're what's the word I'm looking? It's an inclination. You're climbing. Okay, that's why. So There you go. So it's talking about elevation, not direction. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 13. When it was almost time, by the way, which is the sign of first eyewitness testimony. Whoever wrote this knew the land. Because if you're just going by a map, well, then he headed over to Capernaum, and then they went down to Jerusalem. No, that's not what you do. When you live there, you know that's not what you do. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So from Capernaum, he goes up. Well, that's south. Well, you're realizing it's an elevation issue, okay? As your outline says, number one, the Jewish Passover was a festival commemorating the events recorded in Exodus 12. The Jewish Passover was a festival commemorating the events recorded in Exodus 12. So the Passover is always celebrated on the 14th day of the first month of their calendar. It's tied to the full moon at the end of March or the beginning of May. Now, the Passover was the first of three great festivals for the Jewish people and referred to the time that a lamb was slaughtered in Egypt when the people were slaves in Egypt. And the Hebrews smeared the blood of that lamb on their doorposts as a signal to the angel of death to pass over that house as the angel went through killing the firstborn of Egypt. So this was the final plague that convinced Pharaoh to finally release Israel from their Egyptian slavery. And by the first century, Passover had become a pilgrim festival, meaning large numbers of people gathered in Jerusalem every year from all over to observe the celebration. In fact, Jesus would later be crucified in the city during one of these Passover festivals. So, number two, your outline says, you go up to Jerusalem because of the altitude, not because of the direction. You go up to Jerusalem because of the altitude, not because of the direction. So let's read verse 14. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. In the temple courts. Now, let's describe this. This is north, this is south, this is east, and this is west, okay? So this is the temple grounds, if you will. This is where they believe the Antonia Fortress, Antonio Fortress, can't remember, fortress, that's where the Roman garrison would have been lodged there. And then we had would be the main Herod's temple. Then you would have had the altar here. And then, let me just set this up. Then you would have had this. Then you would have had this. And we've had a gate right here. I'll make it clear to you over here, don't worry. Okay, so this was the temple grounds. Okay? And if you're wondering, this is the Kidron Valley and the Gethsemane and all that's over here. And this is the Hinnom Valley, which is for hell and so on. So these are the valleys. But Gethsemane is over here. And the main city is here and here. Okay, there you go. So first of all, Herod's temple complex included a number of temple courts. First of all, letter A is the court of the Gentiles, and that's this one, the court of the Gentiles. It's also known as the outer court. Okay? And so the court of the Gentiles went all the way around. Okay? That's the court of the Gentiles. This is the only place a Gentile, meaning a non-Jew, could go. So if you're here and you're not Jewish and you wanted to go to the temple in first century Jerusalem, the only place you could set foot on was the court of the Gentiles or the outer court. To go past this would have meant your death. And we'll get to that in a moment. They've actually found inscriptions from the signs that were posted here at that time. Okay, and we'll get to that in a second. B was then the court of women. The court of women, which was the next court. Now, men could go into the court of women, but women couldn't go into the next one. Okay? So, and this gate from the court of the Gentiles to the court of the women was known as the Gate Beautiful, or the Beautiful Gate, because beautiful women passed through it. I just made that up. Okay? The Gate Beautiful. Now, we read about this just turn right. This will all start to make sense. Turn right to Acts chapter 3. Just keep your finger there in John too, but turn right to Acts chapter 3, because you remember something happened here. Acts 3, verse 1. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 p.m. Now, a man who was lame from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those going into the temple courts. Okay? When Peter saw Peter and John were about to enter, he asked them for money. Okay? So you can see this would be the perfect place to hang out if you're begging for money, because in here is where the money, the 13 money receptacles were. So people are walking through here with money. And so he's placed there at the gate Beautiful every day begging for money. Okay? So now when you read that in the future, you say, oh, okay, now I know where that is. So, and this is where the offering buckets were placed, in the court of the women here. Okay? And that was called the Beautiful Gate. All right, let's keep going. If a Gentile walked through that beautiful gate, you would be killed, okay, on the spot. In 1871, archaeologists discovered a sign that was posted somewhere near the entrance to the Court of Women. It sits at the Istanbul Museum to this day, and here's what it says. No stranger is to enter within the balustrade, meaning spindles, around the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be himself responsible for his ensuing death. That's what it says. And if you turn to Acts 21, verse 26 to 29, you'll see just how seriously this was enforced. Acts 21, 26 to 29 says, that Paul's in Jerusalem at the temple. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, this is ritual purification, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought them into the temple. So you can see they were furious. Okay, we should kill him. Kill all these guys because he brought a Greek into the temple. I mean, this was serious, serious stuff for them, okay? Okay, so after the men could go into the court of women, and then there's the court of men, also known as the court of Israel. The court of men, or the court of Israel. That's letter C. The court of Israel or the court of men. I think Israel is your blank, I believe. The court of Israel, which is also known as the court of men. And then after that is the court of priests. By the way, I've read that each one is on just the next higher elevation. You step upstairs, I've been told. So then you have the court of priests, where only priests could go in here. And then here's where the Holy of Holies was, the main temple. That's where only the high priest, special priest, could go. Okay? So letter D is the court of priests. So those are the courts. The court of the Gentiles, or the outer court, the court of women, the court of Israel, or the court of men, the court of the priests, and then where only the high priest could go. Now, number 4 on your outline. For the sake of convenience, that's your next blank, for the sake of convenience, during Passover, merchants sold cattle, sheep, and doves, as well as provided services for exchanging money to pay the temple tax. Okay? Now, first of all, why would they sell animals? Well, they did this because people came from far off lands for the Passover. It was a pilgrimage festival. And so instead of having to travel hundreds of miles with a bunch of sacrificial animals on your journey to Jerusalem, they would sell animals here at the temple for your convenience. It only made sense. So what was the temple tax? Well, in Exodus chapter 30 and 38, every Jewish male over the age of 20 had to give an annual contribution to the temple of a half shekel. Now, in the first century, that would be equal to 7 grams of silver. 7 grams of silver was a half shekel in the first century. And so people came from all over the Roman Empire, from all over the known world then, to pay the temple tax. And they would bring with them all kinds of different currencies and coins. It'd be like being at YVR and people from all over the world are coming and they all have, there's a currency exchange somewhere to get local currency, right? Well, to ensure that the temple coffers were not being scammed, the only currency that was accepted to pay your temple tax in the first century was what was known as the Tyrian shekel. Tyrian shekel. Okay? And it was minted in the Phoenician city of Tyre, which was just north here, just north of Haifa, in the modern-day Lebanon. Tyre and Sidon was just north of where this limitation of the whiteboard is. So Tyre was there, Phoenician city of Tyre, modern-day Lebanon, and it was minted there, and it was known for its purity. It was 90 to 95% pure silver. Very high quality. So people would bring their currencies and then exchange them for a hefty fee for the acceptable coinage. So the temple knew we're not getting ripped off. You bring us your Roman drachma or whatever it is you're using, and you exchange it for a Tyrian shekel, and you can give that as your amount. That way they knew the temple received the shekel. So as your outline says, it appears they were doing their selling and exchanging in the court of the Gentiles. That's what it looks like. It looks like all this selling and money changing was happening in the outer courts, in the court of the Gentiles. Okay? Let's read chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. So he made a whip of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Now, as your outline says, from the words John uses to describe the tool that Jesus made, his actions would have been forceful, but not cruel. Forceful, but not cruel. His force was moral rather than physical. His force was moral rather than physical. Why do we say this? Because the term whip of cords, the Greek word there is for an instrument, stalks from a plant known as a rush. So it wasn't these leather straps, with bone attached or anything. It was sort of to get bugs off of things or whatever. So his force, he wasn't being cruel, but he was being forceful. His force was more moral than it was physical. So what was Jesus so upset about? What was the issue here? Well, in the synoptic gospels, remember, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus focuses more on what the people were doing. In those Gospels, Jesus says, "My house is to be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." In John's Gospel, John's focus is squarely upon the where. John quotes Jesus saying, "Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Now, again, different authors can quote different things. Okay? So Jesus, I'm sure, said all of this, but an author can choose how much of a quote to use, okay? And that's what's happening here. So as you notice, John does not include the quote from Jeremiah about the den of robbers. That quote about den of robbers, that's from the prophet Jeremiah. So number 6 on your outline, from the words Jesus spoke, the reason for his anger was simple. The reason for his anger was simple. They had turned a solemn prayer room into an open market. They had turned a solemn prayer room into an open market. So what was intended, this is part of the temple grounds. And by the way, if you've ever traveled with us to Israel, I want to make sure I get this right. Yes. When we have gone and we've walked up and sat on the steps, and these are the steps we were at. And this is the corner we were at when we saw all the stones that had fallen down from the destruction of Jerusalem. And these were the steps, and we saw this purification baths all here. So this is where we were looking up from this point. Okay. Now, what was the intended place here? This was to be an intended place of prayer and worship for Gentiles, non-Jews. So this was like a prayer room, a place, the outer court of the temple where they could come and seek to interact with God, to worship him, to pray, to bow. But now what they had done is turn this into a bunch of stalls on a marketplace with cluttered, cluttered with animals and stalls and coins and shouts and salesmen. Hey, come here, I'll give you a better deal than that person or whatever. It's just this wild marketplace. So, begs the question, does this equate to having a bookstore and a coffee shop or an automated giving center in a church lobby? It's a good question. Maybe I'll answer it someday. Let's keep moving. No. Of course, it doesn't, for a couple of reasons. What was happening in the first century at the temple would be more like us having an ongoing bake sale and a raffle on the church platform in the main auditorium, the main sanctuary, during an Easter Sunday service. And secondly, a church building is not the temple. Now, we need to get our minds around this. The church building is not a temple. The temple was ground zero for the presence of God. That's where you went to worship God. That was ground zero. That's where in the Holy of Holies, symbolically where the Spirit of God dwelt. Who's the temple today? You are. We are now the temple. Remember when Jesus was crucified, the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest was torn from top to bottom, not bottom to top. Symbolizing the presence of God now is open to all of humanity. But lots of Christians get caught up in this thinking that the church is equivalent to the temple. No. In fact, I've never understood why so many Christians rally around someday rebuilding the temple. Why would you support that? I think Jesus, God himself, saw to it that the temple would be destroyed in 70 A.D. So, because that whole system was now de facto finished. That's the old covenant. There's now a new covenant where God pours his Spirit out upon humanity. So to rebuild the temple is a step backwards as a follower of Jesus. It's not a step forward. So the temple is not equivalent to the modern day church. The church is the body of believers. This is a building that we have set aside respectfully to gather together as God's people. But this is not the temple. And to equate it with the temple is to step backwards and to be wrong thinking, okay? So how did Jesus' disciples respond? Well, let's keep reading, chapter 2, verse 17. His disciples remembered what that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. So he's quoting there Psalm 69 and 69:9. As your outline says, Jesus' disciples connected the activity of Jesus with the words of the psalmist. The disciples connected the activity of Jesus with the words of the psalmist. Now this Psalm 69, has a few prophetic allusions to the passion and the pain of the Messiah. If you read it, you'll see other allusions to Jesus in it. So how did the Jewish religious authorities react to Jesus' actions? Well, that's point B on your outline, the authority challenge. Let's pick that up starting at verse 18. The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." Well, they replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Underline that in your Bibles. That's crucial in what we're about to discuss. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words Jesus had spoken. It wasn't until after he was died and rose from the dead that they said, "Oh, remember that day he said this?" Then they believed the scripture and they believed the words that he had spoken. So remember that. They connected the dots after the resurrection. The Jewish authorities' demands are clear. We're the authorities of this temple. By what higher authority do you claim to act the way you've done? And without hesitation, Jesus directly offers proof of his authority. Verse 19, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." Now, let's understand the context of that all this took place in. Discussions like this were a matter of honor for the victor and shame for the loser in that culture. To be bested in a conflict of wits or conflict of views or ideas was to diminish the social status of that person in the culture. If you lost a public discussion like this, your social status was dropped down a notch. That was the shame-honor culture and how it operated. So, as your outline says, there are different ways of understanding Jesus' response in the context of an honor-shame culture. Letter A, there's one way. Jesus laid down a challenge that they failed to pick up. He challenged them to destroy the physical temple, in which case Jesus would have appeared to have won the exchange in the eyes of everyone. He laid down a challenge, destroy this temple and I'll build it up in 3 days. They didn't do it, so he won the exchange. That's one way to look at this. However, that's highly unlikely. No reasonable onlooker would have expected the Jewish authorities to actually destroy the temple in Jerusalem. It would be silly to think that after Jesus laid down this challenge, people in the crowd stepped back and said, okay, authorities, call his bluff, destroy the temple, see how quickly he can rebuild it. It's unlikely that Jesus was seen to have won this challenge on that day. The most likely reaction of the crowd would have been this, letter B in your outline. Jesus' response was nonsensical to his listeners, in which case Jesus appeared to lose the exchange in the eyes of everyone, including his disciples at that time. Jesus' opponents were factually correct, and everybody knew it. It took 46 years for Herod's construction crews to build that massive temple, and everyone in that crowd knew, as far as they understood, that Jesus couldn't rebuild it in 3 days. That was common sense. So Jesus' answer to their question, what sign can you give us to prove your authority? His answer would have been viewed to have gone unanswered by the crowd. They asked, what authority? And he said something silly about rebuilding the temple in 3 days. So that was a dumb answer. That's what they would have thought. So Jesus would have seemed to have lost that debate at that time. This is, interestingly, this is the only honor contest in the Gospels where the verdict was not declared. And perhaps more significantly, where Jesus was not publicly shown to be victorious. As your outline says, number 2, it appears that the second option that I just gave you is probable, as it was only after Jesus' resurrection, years later, that his disciples finally understood what he was saying at this moment. Well, I say years later. If it was according to the synoptic chronology, when there probably is the historical one, it would have been a couple weeks or a week later. But it was only afterwards that they connected the dots, and the disciples finally understood what he was saying at that moment. Okay? So when you read it in that context, it makes sense what they're saying here. He said, destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. They replied, it's taken 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Up until then, they're wondering, looks like he lost that one. Okay? This is why Jesus didn't continue the debate. This is why he initially appeared to have lost the back and forth. It's because Jesus was not truly speaking of Herod's temple, even though it happened right outside Herod's temple. That's not what he was speaking about. He was speaking about the temple of his own body. But Jesus knew he was dropping a mental marker that his followers would remember and come and pick up later. And here's a key truth in the box teaching on your outline. When Jesus was asked to provide the foundation for his authority, he offered his resurrection. When Jesus was asked to provide the foundation for his authority, he offered his resurrection. Today, that is our answer to the identical question. Whenever I'm asked why I believe what I believe, I always go back to the resurrection. As your outline says, we believe what Jesus believed, teach what Jesus taught, live like Jesus lived, love like Jesus loved. Because of his resurrection, It validated his claims. That's what your next blanks are. We do all this because of his resurrection. His resurrection, it validated his claims. Why am I a Christ follower and not a Muslim? Because of the resurrection. Why am I a Christ follower and not Eastern? How do I know the Eastern religions are wrong? Because of the resurrection. Why do I believe the Old Testament? Because Jesus believed the Old Testament. And his resurrection proved that he is who he said he was. So I believe what Jesus believed. I teach what Jesus taught. I seek to live like Jesus lived, love like he loved. Why? Because he rose from the dead. Validating his claims. And as we're learning in the series we're beginning this morning, if you're in the first service, you know what I'm talking about. If you in the second service, then you'd have no idea what I'm talking about, which is the whole theme of this series. Until you have the context, you don't really know. Jesus' resurrection didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a context. It wasn't a guy suddenly rose from the dead out of nowhere. No, there's a whole build-up, a lead-up to it. It validated his claims. And we see here, that's what he's doing. What authority do you have? Destroy this temple, and I will raise my body up in 3 days. That's my authority. And that's what was happening. So it's the same for us today. His resurrection is the foundation of everything. The Apostle Paul said, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we're to be pitied above everyone else. If he didn't rise from the dead, let's eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow we die. What does it matter? John then concludes this narrative with an interesting insight regarding the true nature of humanity. Verses 23 to 25. It says, now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. He knew what was in each person. Okay. First of all, it should be noted, as your outline says, not every miracle and teaching of Jesus is recorded. Okay, that's what John's implying here. While he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed. Okay, so in other words, he's very clear. And other gospel writers have said there's many things. You couldn't write down all that he had done. It's a bit of hyperbole there, but he's saying many things that he did that aren't recorded in this book. So not every miracle, every teaching is recorded. The authors are selecting what they want to include to illustrate the story of the life of Jesus. John's telling us he personally selected the events from the life of Jesus. He's telling us that there were many things that happened that he's not included in his gospel. Some of the other gospel writers may have. He didn't. They had the right to pick and choose. Number two, while people trusted Jesus, Jesus did not trust people. While people trusted Jesus, Jesus did not trust people. 2a, his failure to trust was not because he did not know them. His failure to trust was because he did know them. It's not that he didn't trust because I don't know you yet. I can't trust you. No, he says, no, I know you. That's why I don't trust you. And letter B, he knew they understood the signs to be pointing to him as a political Messiah. This is crucial. He knew that they understood, they conceived the signs to be pointing to him as a political Messiah. To entrust himself to them would be to fail in his messianic mission. If he just entrusted himself to them, they would raise him up on their shoulders and here's our political Messiah, come to kick out these dirty Romans and restore Israel to its political peak. And Jesus says, no, that's not what the Messiah actually is about. That's why he would constantly say to people, don't tell someone I'm the Messiah. Don't tell them I'm the Messiah. He didn't really unveil that till the very end. And he only unveiled that to his closest followers. He kept it quiet on the outside because he didn't want the word spreading and then drawing the attention of the Romans for them to come and stop his ministry, his mission, before it was completed. Letter C. It was his knowledge of each person that enabled Jesus to powerfully, accurately, and uniquely respond to each person. It was his knowledge of each person that enabled him to uniquely respond to each person. The next time we're together, we're going to look at the famous interaction between Jesus and Nicodemus.